So the question that was asked is, why did the Buddha say there is no self? Okay, so this is an interesting question, and it's actually quite a controversial subject, and has been a controversial subject for about 2,500 years. As with all things Buddhist, it goes quite deep, so you have to put your seatbelt on and strap in for a bit of a roller coaster ride. So the simple answer to the question is that he didn't say that. And he was actually quite specific about why he didn't say there is no self, and why he didn't say there is a self. But the idea that the Buddha said there is no self has become a myth, and one that is quite widely believed. So it can be useful to look at where this belief came from, and what the Buddha actually said on this subject. Not least because looking at what the Buddha said on this subject can help us to understand who we are. So it's a very useful inquiry practice, or jnana yoga practice, which means the yoga of knowledge. In the Buddhist writings, we do find places where the Buddha refers to the self. So, for example, this is one verse where he references the self. He says, "Searching all directions with one's awareness, one finds no one dearer than oneself. In the same way, others are dear to themselves. So one should not hurt others if one loves oneself." That comes from the Rajan Sutta, from the Udana section of the Pali Canon. So he's clearly referring to a self there. And then again, if we look at verse 165 of the Dhammapada, we find, "By oneself is evil done, by oneself is one defiled, by oneself is evil left undone, by oneself is one made pure. Purity and impurity depend on oneself. No one can purify another." So again, a clear reference to the self. So where does this idea come from that the Buddha said that there is no self? It actually comes from a particular teaching that he gave, which you could call the teaching on no self, or the teaching on anatta. It was the second discourse that the Buddha gave once he started teaching at the deer park on the edge of Varanasi. Varanasi used to be called Benares, and before that it was called Kashi, so it would have been called Kashi at that time. So what was this teaching that he gave on anatta, or no self? This was actually a teaching on a particular analysis of conditioned phenomena, or things in the world, which is a bit complex. So we'll look at that in a minute. But to summarize it, what the Buddha was saying is that if you look at the things that make up what you normally consider to be yourself, what you find is a collection of things that are in continuous flux, not just one permanent thing. After the Buddha gave this teaching, the question arose in people's minds as to whether the Buddha thought there was a self or not, whether there was simply no self and everyone who appeared to be a self was actually just a sort of bundle of interacting, changing things. And the Buddha was actually asked this question directly: is there a self or not? And when he was asked this question, he remained silent. He simply didn't reply. And then afterwards, one of his monks asked him why he had remained silent. The Buddha replied that if he had given an answer, one way or the other, it could have caused the listener to have become attached to a fixed view, either attached to the fixed view that there is a self, or the fixed view that there is no self. So when the Buddha was teaching, he actually ranked questions on a particular scale. He ranked questions depending on how useful the question was. And there were certain questions that he thought were so risky or potentially distracting or confusing that he wouldn't actually answer them at all, and so would remain silent. And he spelt this out quite clearly in reference to the idea of self. In the water snake simile sutta, he says, Do you see a clinging to a doctrine of self, clinging to which there would not arise sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair? No, Lord, came the reply. Very good, monks. I too do not envision a clinging to a doctrine of self, clinging to which there would not arise sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. So the Buddha's position on the existence of the self was very much centered around the question of attachment to views, and especially the danger of attachment to a fixed view, either one way or the other way. Either attachment to the view there is a self, or attachment to the view there is no self. And we find this again in the middle length discourses, where he said, in a person who thus considers improperly, there arises one of the 6 wrong views. The view, I have self, arises in him really and firmly, or the view, I have no self, arises in him really and firmly, or the view, I perceive self through self, arises in him really and firmly, or the view, I perceive non-self through self, arises in him really and firmly, or the view, I perceive self through non-self, arises in him really and firmly. Or he has the view thus: that self of mine speaks, knows, and experiences the results of wholesome and unwholesome actions. That self of mine is permanent, stable, durable, incorruptible, and will be eternal, like all things permanent. Bhikkhus, this wrong view is called a false belief, a jungle of false beliefs, a desert of false beliefs, a thorny spike of false beliefs, an agitation of false beliefs, and a fetter of false beliefs. Bhikkhus, the ignorant worldling who is bound up with the fetter of false beliefs cannot escape rebirth, aging, death, grief, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair. I declare that he cannot escape dukkha, suffering. So, I told you that you needed to strap your seatbelts on for a roller coaster ride. That's actually quite typical for writing found in the Buddhist Pali texts. Okay, so we can see how the Buddha held the idea that suffering arises from attachment to particular views, including the views there is a self or there is no self. In practice, it wasn't just views or attachment to views that the Buddha was concerned about. In the Kalama Sutta, we find this: don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical deduction, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, or by the thought, this contemplative is our teacher. So views are just one of the things that the Buddha advised against relying on or attaching to when seeking liberation. We also should not rely on scripture, or on logic, or tradition, or on things that we have heard. He advised not to rely on something just because we think it's likely to be true, and not to rely on something simply because our teacher told us it was true. So what can we rely on? Basically, only our own direct experience. And this forms an essential part of the teachings of the Buddha. He was always pointing people back to their own experience as the only true source of knowledge and wisdom. And this knowledge and wisdom arising from one's own direct experience will lead eventually to liberation, or nirvana, or nibbana in the Pali language, literally meaning without flame or without fire. Okay, so what was that teaching on no self, or anatta, that led to all the confusion in the first place? I mentioned earlier that it was a teaching involving the contemplation of phenomenal existence, things that arise and pass away, things that are observed, things that are conditioned by other things, which is in fact all things. So this is from the Dhammapada, verses 277 to 279. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. All conditioned things are unsatisfactory. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. All things are not self. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. So the Buddha was talking about conditioned things, things that are impermanent, and that when we see these things are not self and not leading to lasting happiness, we turn away from identification with them and also put an end to suffering. And this teaching on the not self, or anatta, aspect of all conditioned phenomena is expanded in the Buddha's second discourse at the Deer Park at Varanasi. I have heard that on one occasion the Blessed One was staying at Varanasi in the game refuge at Isipatana. There he addressed the group of 5 monks. Form, that is, our body, monks, is not self. If form were the self, this form would not lend itself to disease. It would be possible to say with regard to form, let this form be thus, let this form not be thus. But precisely because form is not self, form lends itself to disease. And it is not possible to say with regard to form, let this form be thus, let this form not be thus. The Buddha then repeated that, but instead of saying form, he replaced that with feelings for the next verse, with perceptions in the next, with mental fabrications in the next, and with consciousness in the last of that set of 5 verses. These 5 things are referred to as the 5 skandhas, or 5 aspects of conditioned phenomena that go to make up what most people normally think of as themselves. We usually think that we are our body, our feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. So this is a particular teaching, and it's an interesting teaching because it's not a logical teaching. The Buddha is saying that if our body was a part of ourself, we would be able to decide what form it takes, and it can't be a part of ourself because we can't do that. And then he does the same thing with feelings. If our feelings were part of ourselves, we would be able to decide what form our feelings would take, and we can't do that, so therefore they're not part of who we are. And so on with perceptions, mental fabrications, and consciousness. But all this is based on the idea that if something is part of who we are, we would be able to have full control over it. Well, that's not necessarily true, because it could be the case that we might be something and yet not have full control over what form it takes or how it expresses itself. So it's a teaching based on something that isn't logically coherent. So the Buddha is doing something interesting here. He's creating a practice, which is a contemplation practice, and it's a contemplation practice which is based on something which doesn't necessarily make sense. He's saying, in effect, let's assume that if something was an aspect of who we are, we would have full control over it, and if we don't, let's regard it as not self. So this is a liberation teaching. If we do it, it leads to liberation, to nirvana. It does not have to be true in and of itself to work. So this is the Buddha's teaching on anatta, or not self, which led to the confusion about whether the Buddha thought there was an ultimate self or not. It's a teaching that relates only to conditioned phenomena and to the 5 aggregates, the 5 skandhas, or conditions of nature. So these conditioned phenomena are things that are impermanent, that arise and pass away, that are born and die, that are made and that are conditioned. Now, if the Buddha believed that these things were the only things in existence, then he would effectively be saying that there is no self at all. In other words, if the things that make up the universe and the five skandhas, or attributes of conditioned phenomena, form, feelings, perceptions, mental volitions, and consciousness, were all that existed, and he is saying that all these things should be considered as not self, then he would in effect be saying that there is no self at all. But the Buddha didn't say that. He actually said the opposite to that. And this can be found again in the Udana. There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned. If, monks, there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, you could not know any escape here from the born, become, made, and conditioned. But because there is an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, therefore you do know an escape from the born, become, made, and conditioned. So was the Buddha actually saying that although conditioned phenomena, the things in the world, are not self, the self can be found beyond them? Well, he also didn't say that either. Okay? Remember, he said not to become attached to any fixed view on the self. Practice and find out for yourself was always his central teaching. After he passed away, there were Buddhist monks who posited that Buddhists should believe that there is no self. That happened quite quickly after the Buddha's death, and some of those views are recorded in the Abhidharma. There have also been many Buddhist monks and nuns who have suggested that there is a self. They sometimes refer to this as the Buddha nature. So in terms of whether the Buddha thought there was a self or not, we're sort of left hanging, which is what the Buddha wanted. But we're not left completely hanging because we're left with the tools that we need in order to find out for ourselves what is the nature of the self. Don't hold on to fixed views. Don't believe something just because your teacher says it's true or because you read it in the scriptures. Practice wisely and only trust your own experience.